Listeners, what if learning to write is really just learning to be more fully yourself? Today, I'm in conversation with Jeannine Ouellette, author of The Part That Burns and teacher whose deepest passion is using writing to connect us with our humanity. She sees the craft of writing as so much more than the words on a page, and I couldn't agree more. During our amazing conversation, we talk about how writing is a practice that helps us show up more fully in our own lives and how you can do this by finding your writing voice, writing close to the lived experience, and exploring from a place of discomfort. Also, you won't want to miss our conversation about our shared obsession with a particular punctuation mark that we are absolutely claiming, regardless of what anyone else thinks. Let's get started. Welcome to Writing Your Resilience, the podcast for writers who want to write and live the story that sets them free. I'm your host, Lisa Cooper Ellison, a writer, transformational and trauma-informed coach, story alchemist, and fellow traveler on the winding road of healing and creativity. Each week, I'll share tools, practices, and conversations that will help you let go of what no longer serves you as you create stories that change lives, especially your own. Together, we'll explore how to trust your creative voice, support your mental health and resilience, work with your nervous system and unique design, and stay connected to your deepest calling as a writer, even when life gets messy. It's time, my friends, to write and live the story that sets you free. I'm honored to walk that journey alongside you, one story and one episode at a time. Listeners, I have to pause for a second because there's something I really want you to know. So many memoirists I have worked with have had the same experience. They've written what feels like a book, but their manuscript is overloaded. Like the story is buried somewhere inside that material and they can't find it. Structure is what helps you see what belongs and what's pulling your story off course. In my April 29th webinar with Jane Friedman, Find and Refine Your Memoir's Narrative Arc, we'll work through 3 powerful structural models that will help you identify your turning points, cut what doesn't serve the story, and shape your material into a focused, compelling book. The link to register is in the show notes. I'd love to work with you. Well, hello, Jeannine. Welcome to the Writing Your Resilience podcast. I am so happy to have you on today.
Well, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much again for having me, Lisa.
I just want to hold up your book, The Part That Burns, which I have had on my bookshelf. I have mentioned in webinars that I have taught and that I have recommended to so many writers because you are such a gorgeous writer. Just at the line level, I'm in awe of your work. And I feel like there's an energy that shows up on the page that I can feel like a transmission when I am reading your work. And so that's how I feel about you. But, there are going to be some listeners who haven't heard of you before. So what would you like them to know about you?
Well, first of all, thank you. Those were beautiful words. And I taught a workshop yesterday, a 3-hour on Zoom live intensive on voice, where one of the things that I said was that writing can offer a form of transportation to a reader. And what you said, that felt like the highest praise to me. So thank you. And what I would want people to know more than anything is my passion for language and what can happen for us in our lives when we cross this threshold where words are no longer just words, but they're this representation of something so much more powerful. It's that our voice, I'm thinking about, again, I taught a workshop on voice. And so this idea of our voice is part of us. It's physical, it's spiritual. Our breath is part of our voice. And so when we're able to capture that in words on a page, it's part of us. And as we do that, we change ourselves and we change our lives. And we sometimes change other people's lives and the way that we relate to one another. So that's my passion.
Well, and I would say that your passion is contagious because so many people I know are interested in the work you do and they have been touched by it. And there are a number of different things that I want to talk with you about today. But since you mentioned voice, maybe that's a great place for us to start. So you were recently teaching about this, and I will be teaching about this later this year. And here's what I know about voice. Voice is one of the issues I think that is very difficult, especially for new writers to understand. It is also something that creates a lot of angst or anxiety. Like, how do we create this? And what is it? And how does it work? But also, I think it's incredibly important for people who are trauma survivors to feel like they have a voice. What I hear people say, write their truth or speak their truth or share what is on their heart without fear. So let's just begin with a general definition of what is voice, or what are your voices, which is something that you talked about in your Substack.
The first thing I would want to say is that when we're talking about voice in the context of creative writing, I do distinguish that from the way we talk about voice when we say, as you very appropriately honored, trauma survivors, of which I am one, that there's something so urgent and necessary in being able to have a voice, to be able to claim and speak a truth. And those two things, it's not that there's no overlap, but when we're talking about finding our voice as a writer and doing that through the portal of craft, that's a little bit of a different thing. And certainly if you've read The Part That Burns, it did for me. It can include finding our voice as a writer, can encompass the really hard work of being able to tell a story that's really hard to tell in a way that can be a gift for someone else rather than a burden. I think that when we talk about voice, again, I said right at the outset, I'm passionate about this, but understanding the craft of voice, and it's very difficult. It's one of the hardest things to teach. And it's kind of a thorny, complicated craft element to even understand, because we as writers don't have a singular voice. Voice is layered and composed of multiple components. And then we also don't have the same exact voice across projects. When I'm writing The Part That Burns, that's not the exact same voice that belongs to the book that I'm working on now, even though they're both my voice, and I think you would be able to tell they're the same writer, but the project voice is different. And then beyond that, character voice is something that really matters both to not just fiction, but also memoir, because I think if we're doing a good job in our memoir, and the memoir is not highly experimental, so there's always exceptions to every rule, right? But if we're wanting to write a memoir that does what we want it to do, it's probably going to include the voices of other people. And speaking for themselves in direct dialogue in their own voices. And that's another element of voice on the page, is being able to listen hard enough and be able to craft carefully enough to do justice to those other voices. So you can see the way that I understand voice and the way I teach it is it's very complicated, but it's so essential and it's so powerful. When I was teaching yesterday, I realized as I listened to myself speak that even though the way I teach voice says that the voice that we write in is a curated voice, it's not the same as the voice that we use to talk to our partners or our kids or our friends. They're related, they're not wholly separate and distinct, but the voice for the creative work that we're doing on the page is curated. And most of the writers I admire most say the same. But that relationship is really fun to notice. And I noticed it when I was teaching yesterday. And a lot of the people in the workshop were people who read my work on Writing in the Dark on Substack, and or have taken classes from me before. So when I said, I can actually hear traces of my writing voice in the way that I'm teaching right now. It's not that same voice. It can't be, I'm ad-libbing and, it's off the cuff, but I can hear it. And there were nods. And so I think that when we can understand voice, when we can start to really engage with the hard work of understanding voice, the other really cool thing that can happen is we can start to see this multiplicity of voices that we all have, whether we're aware of it or not. We can start to see those voices come into closer alignment with each other. And when that happens, for me, my feeling about it is we're becoming more whole. So I think voice has the capacity. It's another avenue for us to pursue that wholeness.
Yeah, I love that. Voice as a way for us to be whole. And one of the ways that we increase that sense of wholeness is by understanding some of our parts, right? And so Sonya Huber, in her book on voice and on the writing voice, she talks about the various voices that we inhabit in a writing project. And Sue William Silverman talks about the same thing. She and I had this conversation about the prosopon, or the mask that we wear when we approach any piece of writing, right? So we are a specific identity for each piece of writing, and that will change the voice that we're using. You talk about that really beautifully, and about how, yes, there's that specific thing that we're doing that is a piece that's craft, but also it is an embodiment of some aspect of ourself. There is some unique piece of us that shows up in all the things that we write. It's that ineffable piece of voice that we all want to hold on to, and that is so light and airy we can't actually grasp.
I love that. And I love that you mentioned Sue William Silverman, who was one of my grad school advisors. And Sonya Huberman's book on voice was really important to me when I was working on a long, complicated craft essay a few years ago on child narration, which is another aspect of voice. But when you mentioned Sue, it reminded me also of her work on the voice of innocence and the voice of experience in memoir, which is yet another way to look at the layers of voice, even within a project. So our narrating voice is not uniform, across a project. And, so much about creative writing has to do with having names for things. Having names for things allows us to be able to recognize what we see when we're reading and what we're doing when we're writing. And that's empowerment. And so, if you're teaching a 3-hour intense craft workshop, as I did yesterday, you're going to see around that 1.5, 2-hour mark, people kind of feeling like really overwhelmed. And I've been teaching long enough to anticipate that. I know it's going to happen. And I also knew that what I was bringing yesterday was rigorous. Yeah, I wasn't soft pedaling it. It's like, this is a rigorous topic and we're going to really take it on. So when I said that, people looked relieved and they nodded. But what I said to you, don't worry about that now. Let it roll off. You're going to have a replay. You're going to get the notes from this class. Just sort of let it soak in like rain, and you can come back to it once you've slept on it, you've taken it into the body, taken it into memory, come back to it. And all of a sudden, all these terms that I'm using, that some of which you may not have heard before, not heard in this context, I promise will make more sense. May not make perfect sense, but they will make more sense. You'll say, oh yeah, okay, I do get that. And once that starts to happen with these tools of craft, and we can name what we're seeing and what we're doing, that gives us the ability to be intentional. It gives us the ability to do things on purpose. So we're all using the voice of innocence and the voice of experience when we're writing all the time, but we may not know it. We may not be able to identify what we're doing. And once we do know it and are able to identify what we're doing, then we can modulate. We can move in and out, or we can recognize maybe the fact that that reflective voice of experience hasn't shown itself for a while. And maybe, there's an opportunity there. And this is going to come in revision, obviously, but an opportunity to come in and readjust the balance of things. So yeah, I think being able to name things is part of the end all be all of the study of the craft of writing, which is another way to study the craft of living.
Yeah. And when we have language, we understand at a deeper level. And part of not just knowing the words, but embodying those words and understanding them is to allow for this to be practice. Let's lower the stakes. That's what I'm telling people all the time. Let's lower the stakes and just be in that chop wood, carry water mode, so that we can practice this and allow ourselves to understand these words over time. And I say similar things when I'm teaching. I'm like, I'm going to share a bunch. Watch the replay. And also, I think when we're doing this work, one of the things that's really helpful is that as we begin to understand this language and we embody it, we develop our values, so that when we're coming to, say, the concept of voice and writing, we're not just going like, okay, here are the vocabulary words and I know what they mean, or these are the decision points, but what do I value? And this is a piece of voice, but it's not necessarily the deepest heart of voice, but I think it's going to lead to a conversation that we can have around it. And that is, what is your favorite punctuation mark?
I have to admit, and we talked about this in my workshop yesterday because it's controversial, but I don't care. The M dash, it's so powerful. It is so flexible. It can do so many things. And it's also beautiful. Like, just visually, there's something beautiful about them. And so I refuse to give it up, despite the fact that it's supposedly now a tell for AI. I don't care. Almost 30 years ago, when I was editing a regional parenting magazine at that time, my assistant editor dubbed me the M-dash queen. Yeah, I'm not changing that. Yeah, that does tell you a lot about voice, because it took me until the part that burns to really embrace and make the most of, as far as I can within my style, the short declarative sentence, because, my default style is a longer, more meandering, clause-filled, M-dash adorned sentence. And I wanted to say something, though, about your point about practice, because you are so speaking my language when you say that. It's so incredibly crucial. And it's also, I feel like, the most underemphasized and under taught aspects of a creative writing practice, which is a practice. And so when we look at all of the other disciplines across the arts, there will be a very recognizable realm of practice. Musicians play scales, they rehearse, they practice music. Similarly, for dance, artists do color studies and sketches. And yet for writers, we too often, as you said, approach the page every time as if we're making the thing itself. We're making something that's going to be something that is going to belong to whatever project we might be working on or might want to be working on. It seems to me very, very difficult for writers to embrace the idea that this can just be practice, and that the practice in itself, the process of the practice, is valuable. It changes us. It allows us to take risks that we resist otherwise. It allows us to be willing to make messes. Or, like I said earlier, in the part that burns, I played around with, because of that child narrator, a lot of stylistic choices in my writing that hadn't been necessarily inherent to my default writing style. That came through playing around. It came through playful constraints that I didn't necessarily have any idea might become something. They were without expectation. And yeah, I think it's so important to give ourselves, it's a gift, give ourselves the opportunity to play, practice, fool around, make a mess, and not expect it to be anything. And one of the ways that I like to encourage writers to think about that is that we can be a little bit brainwashed, I guess, by this capitalist notion that everything we do has to be productive, and that, if we spent an hour writing without asking it to be anything, we're just maybe practicing various things or trying some new constraints to see what happens or whatever it might be, that's not time well spent, because it didn't produce some kind of like recognizably saleable product. So it can feel really good to rebel against that and say, no, actually, I'm an artist and I need to practice, and it's good to practice and it's joyful to practice. And, I can give myself that time.
Yeah, it's one of the least emphasized pieces of the writing life, is the importance of just practicing for the sake of practice. And I'm going to share a little story about that. But before I do, I just have to say you are of my tribe. I am also an M-dash queen. I love it. And I was having a conversation with several writing friends recently where we all love it. And so how do we embrace it and make it ours, despite what AI is or isn't going to do out in the world? But back to that idea of practice, I spent 4 years in a mindful writing group where we got together, and at one point, we were all over the world. One person was in Australia. There were some of us here. I mean, we figured out time-wise how to make it work. And we got together and we meditated. And then someone brought a prompt or an exercise and we wrote. And then we read it out loud. And there was no expectation it was going to be anything more than that. And some really incredible work came out of that experience for myself and for everyone else involved. But it was because we didn't have an expectation, and we just allowed it to be this experience of like building a sandcastle on the edge of the water. You write something and then you allow it to wash away, and you don't have to own it. You don't even have to work on it again if you don't want to. You can just appreciate it for how beautiful this was and then move on. And I think that that's a practice I encourage people to engage in at whatever stage they are in the writing practice. Because yes, practice is great when you're new, but practice is also how we embrace beginner's mind as a person who has been writing for a while.
I think it's urgently important for people who have been writing for a while because, when I teach, I almost always teach across levels. In other words, from beginner to advanced. And I really believe, and, I think my students would back me up on this, that that's possible. And it's not always possible, but in the way that I typically teach, it is because we're working with the kinds of assignments, and I think of them as invitations that I give to my students that really level the playing field, because the things that I'm asking writers to do are generally outside of the wheelhouse or comfort zone of the experienced writers in the room, and asking them to do things that, they're so specific and so constrained that they don't allow an experienced writer to just come to the page the way that, again, like kind of in that default mode, the way that they typically always would, which actually can be the hardest for the experienced writers. Why? Because once we think we know how to do something and we can pretty reliably produce a pretty decent paragraph or whatever in response to a pretty open-ended prompt, that's going to typically be what, especially in a group, it's human nature. That's going to be what a writer is inclined to want to do. Well, we want it to be what I call, we want it to be good, right? I don't want to write something bad. I want to write something good. And now you've given me this laundry list of things I have to do. How will I know if it's going to be good? Like, I don't have control over the material anymore, which is the point. Oh, I don't have control over it. I don't know what's going to happen on the page. And that is exactly the point. So let ourselves have opportunities to surprise ourselves, to do things that deliberately take us out of that comfort zone where we're able to produce on repeat in a way that, yes, will very possibly and probably likely produce good writing. But in my way of thinking about writing, creative writing is meant to be creative. And to create inherently means to make something new. And in order to make something new, particularly when our tool is language is exhausted right now. Language is a depleted, exhausted, abused tool. Words have been debased. And now this is what we have to work with. So if we want to take this tool with which we are all inundated in our daily lives, in the digital world, on screens, with AirPods in our ears, hearing podcasts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, this tool with which we are utterly inundated, if we want to breathe life into that tool, if we want to make it, as Wendell Berry says, capable of telling the truth again, if we want to make it into art that can simultaneously hold beauty and tragedy and sorrow and humor, then we probably, and in my view, definitely need to give ourselves some new ways into the language, new ways onto the page that help us to cross over that threshold out of the familiar into the unknown, where we have a real chance of discovering something that is new, that we did create, that surprises us. And when that happens, when I see it happen in a workshop and somebody says, wow, I don't know where that came from, it's like being in a trance. And you look up and you say, I don't even know what to say about this. I don't know where it came from or how I made it. And they like it. That's, this is always so somebody, this is like, I don't know what it is, but it was surprising and I kind of like it. And that's really exciting. And that can happen, again, whether you started writing last week or you've been writing, for 30 years like I have.
Now, can you give us an example of an exercise you might give to a group that shakes people out of their comfort zone?
So my workshop, the original workshop, Writing in the Dark, it preceded Substack. I started teaching it at the very beginning of the pandemic, which is where the name came from, because this was this time of mass uncertainty. So what is that? 6 years now running, this kind of continuously running workshop. It goes 6 weeks at a time, then a new session starts, etc. And I almost never teach the same thing twice. It's always new material because so many people take the workshop so many times. So I don't want to be repeating things that they've already studied before and prompts that they've already done a lot of times before. So by necessity and also just by my own curiosity, a lot of the exercises in that workshop have gotten more constrained and more tighter and more steps. And so they would be too hard to explain on this podcast. However, we did an exercise yesterday in the voice workshop. It's not revolutionary. I didn't make it up. This is an exercise I think all writers should be doing on a, more regular basis. It's just an imitation exercise. So we took a piece of writing. Writers could supply their own. And if they didn't have anything, I had something from Joanne Beard for them to look at. Some of them swapped out theirs for hers because it really was a great passage from The Fourth State of Matter. And they got a certain amount of time, and the instruction was really study this short passage. Like you said, how does the writer, what are their sentence lengths and rhythms, punctuation, what kind of imagery, what kind of repetition? Look for as much as you can in the constrained amount of time we had to work with to really get under the skin of this writer's craft choices. Then we had a certain amount of time, not long, maybe 6 minutes, to write 150, 200 words, attempting to write in the style of that writer. We came back from it. People shared what happened for them. And very common response to it was that they were really surprised and taken with the sound of their own voice that was in their voice. It was their voice in this other container, to the point where one person even said, is this okay? Like, can I use this? Is it wrong ethically? Is it plagiarism? Which it's not. And that's a whole other conversation. We did talk about writing things after other writers, etc. But learning from another writer's style and discovering a short passage that you love because you tried the Hemingway-esque short literal declarative sentences or George Saunders' wry kind of tragic irony. No, style isn't, we don't own it. And we modulate it within a piece. So anyway, just the whole point being that being boxed in by these technical craft choices of another writer, for many people in the workshop, it seemed unlocked something that they couldn't have gotten at just free writing.
Yeah, I love that exercise. I've given it to clients and to students for years, and I've used it myself because I think there is something that wakes up in you in response to that voice that helps you clarify something about your own voice as you do it. And I will often have people choose 3 different writers who have very different styles and do something in succession and just see what happens. Like, how are you transmitting or translating that information, right? How is that showing up in your work? And another very simple constraint that I learned, gosh, I think this was 20 years ago off of MySpace. Okay. We're going like way back 20 years ago. What was it? Chuck Palahniuk. He put this challenge out and he said, for 6 months, remove the words feel and know from your vocabulary, like just that, and then see what happens. And I was just amazed at how much it pushed me to write clearer sentences, to think about what I was actually trying to say or what emotion I was trying to express from just that simple constraint.
You're speaking my language right now because I have a lot of opinions about interiority that aren't necessarily, in line with the way that I hear other writing teachers talk about it. And my theory about that is simply that we're in some ways saying the same thing. It's just that when we talk about interiority, I don't think that we tend to give writers, beginning writers, learning writers, enough tools to differentiate between one kind of interiority and another. And so this interiority that begins with I feel, I know, is a very filtered interiority that brings us straight inside, the intellectual abstract mind of another human being. When we can capture the kind of interiority that is also at least partially embodied, because like you said, we take away those filtering tools of I feel, I think, I know, whatever. As exactly as you said, it forces us to look more closely, think a little harder, reach a little further, to express something in a way that isn't that same default way. And I think we're very similar in our teaching aesthetic and sensibilities, because your exercise of, looking at 3 very different writers to imitate in succession. One of the things I really love for people to do is choose a passage from a writer that is so far out of your style range, like that it's ridiculous, really, really stretched. Choose someone that you couldn't write like that person and wouldn't want to, even if you could, and imitate that and see what happens. And it's inevitably and almost always, as far as I know, like it's surprising, because you realize that, maybe there's this one sentence in there that you come up with by doing that. And you say, wow, the gift and the joy, the delight of seeing yourself yourself write something that isn't familiar to you. Think about why we started writing. I said a few minutes ago, I've been writing for 30 years, but that's just professionally. I've been writing since I was a kid. And I think that most of us who are very passionate writers, we have been writing all of our lives. We did develop this relationship with language when we were children. And at that time, it was fun. There was real joy and pleasure in making sentences and making stories or poems or whatever little books that we probably most of us made and taped them or stapled them together. It was joyful. There was nothing torturous about it. It was really the pleasure of art making. And that tends to get lost along the way as we move along in the writing life. And it's really important to engage with practices that reignite it. We can't eliminate the hard work of writing as adults. There are hard parts, especially if you're seeking to publish. There's going to be parts that are very taxing. And, I've spoken a lot about the fact that I didn't really enjoy writing a book proposal. That's not my sweet spot. So there are things we have to do that we don't want to do and that aren't our favorite. But if we don't at least keep that part of us alive that has that joy and that spark and that sort of like, wow, this is fun response to writing, then we're really losing something, and it shows in the work.
Yeah, it really does. And I think that aliveness is something that I want to talk about with you, because we've been talking about what I would call the headspace of writing, right? The craft of writing from the sense of like what happens on the page, but there's also what happens in the heart. And that's one of the things you talked about at the beginning of this episode, is that studying the craft of writing is studying the craft of being a human being, right? This awakens you to your own humanity. And another thing that you say on your Substack is that writing saved your life. So tell us more about that aspect of the writing life.
I say writing saved my life, and I really believe it. I've had some really hard times in my life, but I've never wanted not to be alive. However, I cannot imagine that I would have been able to be alive in the life that was meant for me had it not been for the discovery of writing. And I think that is because I learned, at a really early age, by the age of about 9, that I could make things with words that in some way, shape, or form, however small at that time, externalized part of an internal experience that I didn't fully understand there at that time, that was scary, in which I was trapped, that I didn't have any escape routes. But through language, I was able to take pieces of that and make things from it. Not to in any way say that I was like writing memoirish stuff. I wasn't, but I'm thinking of this poem that I wrote in 6th grade that, captured this sense of like complete aloneness, right? It wasn't about me. It wasn't about my life, but I knew like on some subconscious level what it was doing. And it was like, oh, and my teachers really loved it and they thought it was beautiful. And that was this experience of, oh, I can take like a bad feeling inside of myself and I can make something that is separate from me, but part of me, but has light in it. It was very empowering. And I think, it gave me a lifeline to hold on to for the whole rest of time. And I think, this understanding of how writing, the study of the craft of creative writing, is just another way to get closer to understanding the craft of living, comes from the recognition that everything that we talk about on the page also applies to living a human life. Think about this whole complicated conversation we've had about voice. And then think about how that helps us understand the ways that we modulate our voice across arenas of our lives, or in different relationships. And the difference between interiority and exteriority. And when we begin to understand that, how that is a tool that it has so much applicability in our daily life. You said something about stakes at the beginning of the episode. I use the idea of stakes. So in fiction, we talk about, and we have to talk about it in memoir too, what's at stake here? And every time a sticky situation comes up, I will ask myself, what's at stake here? What's on the line? And that question helps me to understand what I can let go of, because so often, like so many agents will say about so many novel manuscripts, there's not much at stake. And so when there's not much at stake, I can breathe that out. I don't really have to, sweat this. The idea of desire in writing, we know when we study the craft of writing that a protagonist, whether it's us in our memoir or a main character in a novel, has to want something. That desire is this engine. Desire desire drives plot. Same thing in our life. And, one of the tools that I use with writers to look at this idea of desire is that as the writer, we need to know what the character wants, why they want it, and what are the misbeliefs getting in their way of getting it, and then also what's at stake if they do or don't get it. Well, when you start to think about that all the time in your writing life, you are definitely more aware of it in your living life. What is it that I want? Why do I want it? What are the misbeliefs getting in the way of my getting it? And what's really at stake if I do or I don't get it? The truth is that it's very easier, I think, than most people recognize, to be moving through your life in a direction based on what might be a largely unexamined desire. And it might, in fact, even be a false desire. It might be something that we once wanted, but we no longer actually really want, but we're still, trudging along the path toward getting it because we aren't necessarily engaged in a really alive, frequent practice of examining, what do we want and why do we want it? So those are just a few examples of the way that I see narrative, the study of creative writing and narrative, informing the way that we can become more whole and actualized as human beings. And it really makes me feel empathy for anyone who doesn't have any access to the craft of writing as a tool for understanding human beings. Writing and psychology are probably the two closest fields. What I mean to say by that more clearly is psychology is probably the field closest to creative writing. And we can't really be as effective, I think, as we'd like to be on the page and create work that is as compelling and true as we want it to be without having some basic understanding of human psychology. Because we have to have this curiosity, like we have to have a very burning curiosity to understand the characters in our stories, again, fiction or nonfiction. And in order to achieve that understanding, that's what psychology is. It's about motive and consequence and, behavior and human inconsistency, the way that we do things that are out of character. And so, looking at those dynamics and understanding how they're working on the page is so powerful to understanding how they're working in real life. Subtext, Lisa. Think about subtext.
Yeah.
When you learn to use subtext as a tool on the page, and it is a powerful tool, you begin to so much better understand the subtext of life. When you begin to understand the power of metaphor on the page and, what metaphor can and can't do, what really is a powerful metaphor and what might be a surface constructed metaphor that's not really doing much work other than like putting words together in a writerly way, which I don't recommend, then what happens? You begin to look around you and the whole world comes alive with metaphor because everything has the capacity to represent something else or evoke something else. When we begin to understand, we begin to see all of that. And I guess last of all, so you really got me going in my real passion area here, but we can't really, this is an absolute, this isn't like, in my opinion, or this is what I think, this is for real. We cannot be truly the creative writers that we want to be if we do not learn to pay attention, really truly pay attention the way Mary Oliver has compelled us to do, the way Annie Dillard has asked us to do. We have to learn to look at the world, not inside of ourselves, but look out into the world and see things and see them in detail as they are. So think about that for a second. If that's a requisite skill for writing well, and it is, the practice of that skill, which is difficult, it's much harder than it sounds. Marie Howe says that it hurts us, that it literally hurts us to sit with things as they are. You said during a meditation, don't make a story out of something. We always want to make a story out of something. And by the way, I was making a story out of it. We always want to do that. We're very quick to turn everything into a story. Looking at the thing itself holds us back from that long enough to start seeing through the thing. That's where the real magic starts. And if we are practicing that, and it has to be practiced because it's not something that we can just achieve and then we're there. We're always going to slip away from it because really it's an aspect of mindfulness. And so if mindfulness were easy, it wouldn't be a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? So we have to keep practicing every day, practice. And if we can achieve that as a practice in our life, well, that changes everything. That changes everything about how we live, how we understand who we are in the world, how we understand the people around us, how we understand the relationships between. I think writing and living are, one and the same coin with two sides.
That is such an apt metaphor for the experience. And yeah, writing and learning the craft of writing and understanding why you have to pay attention helps you be in the present moment, right? And as writers, we are often present fully, like if we're doing it well, which of course we don't always do it well, we're here and then we're also collecting and maybe reflecting. So there's this dynamic interplay that's happening as we're doing that work. And so there's so much about the life we're living that can come from that. And what I've also seen is that back when I was in graduate school, I think this was 2010, my supervisor said, you can't change the past, but you can change the story you tell about it. There is something really powerful about writing down the story that you're holding and then using the tools of craft to empower yourself to understand it in a new way, to have mastery over it in some way so that maybe it's not okay. Maybe it was painful. Maybe you didn't have power in that moment, but you have power now.
There's something else about what you said. I really ascribe to that. And if we make something that we can love out of something that we lived that was painful, that was hard, over which we had no control, if we can make something that has some element of light in it or beauty, that becomes the new version of the experience. So this is just human cognition. That becomes more important than the memory itself. And every time we revisit the work of it, the writing work of it, the crafted version of it, it's really difficult to articulate how profound a healing that is, because we're taking something that often we had no agency over and making something out of it. And now we're the creator of it. And even though it can still contain everything that was hard, it's still true, it's real. Now we've shaped it into something. And this is why I like to teach the difficult but exhilarating craft of making beauty out of trauma, because it's absolutely possible to write about really difficult things in a way that still has a luminous, beautiful quality. And when we can do that, the result, I feel like it's really extraordinary. I know that for me, writing The Part That Burns has completely changed my relationship to those childhood events and even the more difficult young adult events in that book. Everything that happened still happened. Like you said, it doesn't change what happened in the past, but it surely changes the feeling of it in the body.
Yeah, Melanie Brooks' book, Writing Hard Stories, every single author had something to say about that was very similar. That when the book was done, it was like they exhaled and whatever that energy was, the original energy around that experience, it had been transformed into something else. And I think that is one of the most powerful things that can happen from memoir and writing about true life stories or true experiences that we've had. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. I'm going to, poke the bear on one thing just to push you a little further as we begin to wrap up. And that's, you like to push your students to see things in a new way, right? And often we have to go to the place that's a little scary or a little uncomfortable. So when you think about your writing life and the work that you do, what is the piece that's maybe a little itchy, a little scary, a little dipping the toe into the unknown for you?
Up until I wrote The Part That Burns, the most difficult and elusive thing for me, the thing that I had not been able to do, was to write about my childhood. That just wasn't available to me. And I knew that I had to crack that nut, in order to kind of like finally be able to write about anything else in a really true way. And I think that that is the biggest area of unknown for me. So now that I've written The Part That Burns, I did that. It actually is surprisingly easy for me now to write about childhood stuff. And what I've discovered is that I spent a lot of years writing really pretty essays about everything that happened like after the age of 18. And I think what will be the question for me to engage with in this next season of my writing life is how much, if at all, because I don't really know what I want yet, but how much, if at all, can I write truthfully about my life? How close can I get to the lived life now? It's like, how close to the fire can I come? Because what I was doing before, the kinds of essays that I wrote before were pretty, but the truths that they contained were all subterranean. I think that's why they were better than the sum of their parts, because there was something there there, even if I wasn't revealing it. There was something felt, there was something incongruous about those essays, but they weren't really writing into the center of it. I had to get through the part that burns to be able to do that. But it still kept the adult version of me really safe, because the part that burns ends by intention, 25 years ago. It's interesting. I appreciate that question, because since I write on Substack so prolifically, and that includes a lot of writing that people know what's going on in my life, right? But like we all know, anyone who's kind of very public like that, it's also curated. And if I were going to write into like the fire of the lived life now, it wouldn't be on Substack, because there's a division for me between my creative writing as art and my newsletter, which is a vehicle for teaching. Yeah, so I guess thank you for that, because I think that's a question that has been rolling around in there in my mind. It's not about writing another memoir. I'm not saying I would or wouldn't. That's not the point. It's just sort of like more the artistry of it. How close, if at all, do I want to come to the threshold of the now in a truthful way?
Well, I'm going to be thinking about that and thinking about how that relates to my own writing, because I think there can be that safety in looking back over time at an event that shaped you, but it isn't part of your experience now. But writing into the now, there's a lot of charge and a lot to navigate.
Think about Joan Didion and, some of these essayists who have written into the now. Even The Fourth State of Matter by Joanne Beard, was really writing it up to the threshold of the lived life. And so there's just so much courage in that. And some of the memoirs that have come out recently too. So anyway, it raises food for thought. Yeah. So thanks for the question.
You are very welcome. And I could talk to you all day, Jeannine. I really could. And yet we all have things we have to do in the day. So as we wrap up, I just want to say first, my heartfelt thank you for being on here, for the generosity of your knowledge and your expertise and all of the things that you shared today. If people want to learn more about you, they want to subscribe to your Substack, they just want to figure out what you're up to, what are the best ways for them to do that?
Well, definitely Writing in the Dark on Substack. I'm there almost every day. So that's a great place to jump in. And I just want to acknowledge the community there, actually, because it is unique and extraordinary as a community of human beings who are writers, yes, but also surgeons and teachers and firefighters and, retirees and sailors who are literally out at sea right now, and all over the world too. This incredible diversity of human experience, everyone cheering each other on, supporting each other, sharing work if they want to. It's never a requirement, but engaging with this important work of writing ourselves a little closer to our own humanity. And it's a really beautiful community, so they deserve a lot of credit for making Writing in the Dark what it is. So would love to see you there. I'm also on Facebook, like most people my age, and Instagram, and try to keep up there a little bit, but mostly Substack.
Well, the links for all of this will be in the show notes. So listeners, fear not, you will know exactly how to reach Jeannine. And Jeannine, once again, thank you so much for being here. It has been just an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, thank you. It was a delight. I loved it.
Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Jeannine and her work at Writing in the Dark, please see the show notes for this episode. And if you'd like to take this conversation a little deeper, go to your bookshelf and grab a book off of it by a writer whose work is nothing like yours. Take 5 minutes to study the first 3 paragraphs of their book. Then think of a situation you'd like to write about in your own life and try to write it in that author's style. You can make my day by sharing one thing you learned about your voice and yourself from this exercise in the YouTube comments. I'd love to hear from you. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. I couldn't do this podcast without your support. If you love this episode, here are 3 simple ways that you can keep this show thriving. 1, subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. 2, leave a 5-star review so others can find the show. 3, join my engaged, dynamic community by signing up for the Writing Your Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Ditch Your Inner Critic, 5 tools to transform self-doubt into self-support. Until next time, remember that your story matters. As you write and connect with the truest, most authentic version, you become not just the writer, but the person you're meant to be. And that, my friends, is the real freedom writing can offer.